So there's a saying that, and it goes, cometh the hour, cometh the man or the woman. And I think we are definitely in strange times with all the crisis going on, particularly with the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's also an opportune time for ministers of health everywhere to step up and emerge as leaders and lead the world through this sort of difficult time and difficult period. And I think in order for the ministers to exercise sort of this leadership, they need to know what their primary role would be in this particular crisis. They can't do everything. And I think it starts from the role of the Minister of Health as the person whose primary focus should be on protecting lives of the country's citizens. So a lot of conversations are going on right now. Some are macroeconomic, some are security related, some are demographic related. But the Minister of Health primarily should be that person advocating that lives should be saved. And a lot of the interventions that he or she might lead should be such that they center around or they center on ensuring that lives are protected. And in order to carry out this core function, they will have to exercise technical leadership, particularly in providing clarity in both the articulation of the problem as well as articulation of the strategy. There's a lot of information out there. Some of them are not particularly clear. For instance, we're not sure what the right, interventions would be in treating people who are already affected and ill with the virus. And it's their role to separate fact from fiction, to actually bring clarity to the entire process so that all sorts of responses will be fact-based and backed up by evidence. And in order to do that, they need to be seen as credible technical leaders that can explain these things to other stakeholders. They also need to be the ones who are mobilizing, the whole government response, and they should be the ones to anchor it. Even though it's going to be a multi-sectoral response, I think the Minister of Health should be the one anchoring this and also keeping everybody focused on what the primary goal should be, which is to safeguard lives and livelihoods of people. Most ministers of health as well are in the country's executive leadership. So they also have an advocacy role to make sure that this continues to stay and remain a priority. They should advocate for equity so that the poor and the vulnerable are not left out in the response and what's going on. And also in ensuring that while this is a crisis and deserves rightfully the amount of attention it's getting, that other people who are also suffering and afflicted by other things are also not forgotten in this whole crisis and situation that we have going on. So yeah, I see the minister's role definitely as the advocate, as the technical leader, and as the coordinator of the response. Well, I was in government. I mean, it was a rich experience, and there are so many lessons and so many things that can be applied to this. I was in government when Nigeria had the Ebola crisis, and there were certain approaches that the government undertook that helped the response, in addition to some of the efforts by individuals like Dr. Adadevo at the Index Hospital that was affected. Before government, one thing is that the problem is not a technical problem alone. So it's an adaptive problem, as they would say. So it's really important for the leadership to, particularly those in the health sector, to get away from their comfort zones, because this is a problem that would test skills that the leadership are not typically used to. It requires actually getting other people in other sectors that you don't have direct control over to actually act in a certain way. It means that you have to work sometimes within the bureaucracy of government, but also sometimes you have to innovate around that bureaucracy to get things done. So you're less process driven now, and you now have to be more outcomes driven in your approach. And so these new skill sets that are needed, a lot of problem solving, less hierarchy, is a new way of working for many. And I think it's important that the leadership becomes more used to that, right? It's also important to depoliticize the epidemic, right? In many countries, it's important because a lot of ministers are political appointees, and there's always the tendency to color the information or spin it in a certain way that either makes the government look good, or some other opposition government not so good. One of the things that's really important that there's only one common opponent and enemy here, and that's in this case the virus that we're trying to deal with. And so it's time for depoliticizing the response. So it shouldn't be one of those cases where a state or a region is an opposition region, and that sort of colors the response. And it shouldn't be one where facts are not communicated as facts, because we fear that it might have an untoward effect on elections. So it's really important, because without the credibility of the government and the leadership, you can't get people to comply with some of the tough decisions that we're asking them to put in place. And part of that credibility is enhanced when people know that it is apolitical and there is a communication of just facts, and we are sticking to the facts. And we've all come together to address a common problem that affects everyone, irrespective of tribe, religion, political affiliation, etc. Another thing I feel that will be very useful is the need for central coordination. There should be one source of the strategy. Now, in bigger, more devolved countries, you could have, you know, branches of that leadership, at work or at play. But there should be coherence, such that there should be one central coordinating function at the leadership, probably at the national level, and that sets the norms and the guidance and communicates with the public at large. It will be a disaster if you have multiple sources of information, and if they clash or are inconsistent, then there might be a major problem. So it's critical that there is that formalized central coordinating structure that is led usually by the Minister of Health or any other very high level appointee delegated to head it, that actually drives the strategy and drives the communication. Another thing is really the need to rapidly dispel any misinformation. So once you hear about any rumor or anything going on in social media, it's best not to just ignore it and allow it to fester. It's important to address it, debunk it, or if there is lack of clarity around it, for instance, at the moment where there's a lot of confusion about the efficacy or effectiveness of certain medications like hydroxychloroquine, it's important to address it and stick to the facts on what we know and what we don't know, rather than ignoring it. And I think lastly, the importance of data cannot be overestimated. It's really important that we communicate figures, we communicate data, and not just opinions. So the factual communication is really important for the government, because it's the data that people remember, it's the data that they will hold on to. So they need to know some of the indicators you're tracking, and they need to have a sense of if progress is being made, or if success is still further along the line. So those are some of the things I would suggest were lessons that were learned then, that hopefully could be very useful now. And then one more thing before I leave this is also try not to apportion blame to people. So it's not a blame game. So where, for instance, one begins to blame the victims become, those who are blamed for the problem. It's not helpful. It pushes people away, and you don't have people coming out and showing up for testing, etc. So we need to avoid the stigmatization and the blame game that comes with such crisis. The delivery unit is it takes many forms and many shapes, right? And I think it's a very useful tool in the hands of the leadership and the policymakers, and it can actually drive things. Now, why do you need a delivery unit? I think that's the first place to start, and we should define the functions, right? The delivery unit is needed because it's almost like a catalyst, right? It's because at times like this, business as usual will not work. The bureaucracy is not necessarily organized to respond rapidly in a crisis. Most bureaucracies are put in place to ensure compliance with laws, regulations, and policies. At times of crisis, those things may not be as responsive as you want. So you need units that can either support the system by working side by side with those in the government, or by just taking over certain functions in the short term. To like every catalyst will help make things work faster. That might be their role, and in performing that role, there are a couple of things such units will do. One is really about data. All the response in this type of crisis rely on credible data that is collected, that is analyzed, and from which we can draw actionable insights from. And this is, for me, at the core of what the delivery units can do, right? It's really making sure the right data is being collected, it's been analyzed, and the problem solving around it to come up with the insights that the minister or any other member of the leadership can actually take an action is available. And then these have to be done routinely. So there have to be routines to the way these things are done. In peacetime, so to speak, this could be done monthly, etc. But at times like this, the frequency could be increased. It could be done daily, it could be done weekly, as needed, right? I think delivering it will also be good to build capacity, because some of these efficient ways of doing things should rub off on the broader civil service, right? And broader government. So part of their role is also to make sure that other people in those regular bureaucracy are exposed to this approach and this way of doing things. So that as time goes on, there are more people within the system who think this way and who can work this way, can respond this way in terms of emergencies. Now, in terms of the way the delivery units are set up, the form that it takes, different things have been. There are delivery units that are made up largely of those in the government. There are delivery units that are made up largely of those who are external to the government but are brought in for some of these specialized skills. And there's something in between where you have a mix of both, right? And they've been called different things. Some are called delivery units. In some instances, you have what you call emergency operating centers. You have control rooms. You have war rooms. Whatever you call them, it's really creating a unit that is focused on this particular issue, driving the performance and the delivery of these outcomes in almost a ruthless, prioritized, and rigorous way, and leverages heavily on data and its analysis and the insight that comes from it. So I think, and they are not necessarily those who are seen; they tend to be behind the scenes. And I think in every major initiative, they are very critical for that. In Nigeria, for polio eradication, an emergency operating center was set up for the Saving 1 Million Lives initiative. There was a delivery unit, and the minister then also had a delivery unit that helped with different things. And it was a mix of both external people and as well as those from governments in that mode. And I think finally, I think in terms of its how long should you have one? And I think it depends on, I mean, there should be an objective and a clear purpose for why you're setting up a delivery unit. And once you have achieved that purpose, then you start thinking whether you want these routines and mindsets to become embedded in the system, and then think through how they'll be embedded. But the most important factor for success is that the principal, and that could be the minister, it could be the prime minister, it could be the president, for whom this delivery unit is set up, has to provide the support and the authority and the authorizing environment for them to function. Like I said, they are the invisible ones that do a lot of the work behind the scenes, but give the leadership, and the political leadership in particular, the information and data for them to make critical decisions and for them to actually lead effectively, particularly in times of crisis like this.